Good afternoon and welcome to Solar Valley's Consortium's our 1 hour webinar presentation of Edison International's countdown to 2045. Report is SCE's analysis of the steps that California must take to meet the 2045 targets of clean electricity grid and to reach carbon neutrality. My name is Ron Leverage. I'm a longtime political science professor at UCR and co-chair of the Solar Valley Consortium. The consortium is in UCR's CSERT, College of Engineering Center for Environmental Research and Technology. More specifically, the consortium is under the SCRI, Southern California Research Initiative for Solar Energy. Alfredo Martinez Morales is its managing director and co-chair of the Solar Valley Consortium. Specific thanks are in order. First, thank you for joining the webinar. The registered number is over 55. Thanks to Fred Schwartz, the consortium's executive director, for his work and leadership, the preparation and organization of this webinar. The format today is a presentation by Stephen Collins, SCE's manager for strategic planning and the lead author of Countdown to 2045. Then 3 expert respondents will offer their comments and the ideas presented. Fred Schwartz will be the moderator. We'll introduce the 3 experts. At the end, there will be a Q&A time for Zoom participants, so please use the chat box. Now it's my honor and an opportunity to introduce our speaker. Stephen Collins is SCE's senior manager for strategic planning, and he was the lead author of Countdown to 2045. Stephen has worked in a variety of SC roles since his first engineering internship, including technology strategy and T&D, microgrid market assessments with EIX, special projects in customer service e-mobility group, and climate and sustainability risk in ERM. He holds bachelor degrees in electrical engineering and physics from the University of Southern California and Gordon College. Welcome, Stephen Collins.
Hey, thank you so much, Ron. A pleasure to be here with everyone. My computer's running a little slow, so let me try to get my slides up on the screen, and then I look forward to spending 25 minutes telling you all about our Countdown to 2045 analysis from this year, and then getting into a conversation about what it really means. What are the takeaways, and what's all this mean for us in California as we look into the years to come. So hopefully you can see the slides up on the screen. Just put something in the chat if you can't. As introduced, this is our analysis from Edison International, the parent company of the Southern California Edison utility, on how to achieve California's decarbonization goal for the year 2045. So in order to achieve net zero emissions across the entire statewide economy, there is a big energy transition that needs to take place. We first put a plan out into the public in 2019, and we called it Pathway 2045. And it was a monumental paper that's really helped to shape our company strategy and also helped guide conversations throughout the state. We updated it this year. A lot has changed since 2019, and I'll cover that in just a little bit. But our updated analysis shows that achieving the state's goal is going to be a big lift. And we show specifically with a detailed assessment all the different parts of the energy transition that are going to be affected by that. When you compare it to what some of the previous analysis, ours and others across the state, have shown, the changes that we've incorporated this year show we're going to need even deeper electrification. So transportation and building electrification are the big strategies for economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction, because the emissions with the built environment and with transportation are significant contributors to statewide greenhouse gas emissions. And by transitioning those to zero emission electric vehicles and appliances at a significant extent, 90+% of vehicles and appliances, that's going to be the big kind of core pillar for decarbonizing. But to get those appliances decarbonized, it needs to be a decarbonized clean energy generation that powers them. So the generation mix is getting cleaner and it's getting larger. And we're finding that in total in California, we'll have more than twice as much generation in 2045 to power all that electrification as we have today. When it comes to clean energy resources specifically, including solar, wind, and storage, that's actually triple what we have online today. The grid will need to expand to connect that clean energy generation to all of that electrification load. So we're finding that the transmission system will need to accelerate the pace of the build out up to about 4 times what the historical rate has been for transmission development. And on the distribution side, could be even higher. Using the technologies and the designs we have today, we may reach a pace about a decade from now where we're adding distribution capacity with new projects at about 10x the pace that we've been adding it historically. This is all in the name of connecting these clean energy resources to all of these new electrified appliances and achieving the decarbonization goal. The great news is this is a feasible and a cost-effective path. And when you think about what each household has to pay for their energy, in 2045, household energy expenses will be lower than they are today. There'll be a greater investment in the electric system and a larger electric bill to cover all this, but the savings from fossil fuels, whether that's natural gas bills for a home or paying for gasoline at the pump, will more than offset the additional expense for this clean energy transition. So that's the big picture of our analysis. I'm going to walk through for the next 20 minutes a little bit more detail what we did and how we did it, and really ultimately why it matters. What are some of the big key takeaways? And hopefully that creates a good springboard for discussion. The big changes since 2019 happened on the policy side, but also on the markets and the technology side. The number one change that catalyzed the new analysis is the passage of Assembly Bill 1279 in California last year. When this was signed into law, it established carbon neutrality by 2045 as sort of a binding law for the state and not just a goal. But it also specified that achieving that would require an 85% reduction in direct greenhouse gas emissions from the 1990 levels. So that limits offsets and carbon removal to really no more than 50% of the equation. So we know we have to look for direct greenhouse gas emissions reductions in every sector to make such a large cut. Power production, the built environment, transportation, but also industry and agriculture. There are other complementary policies that are helping to push this pathway along. The governor passed a zero emissions vehicle order. So starting in 2035, all new light duty vehicles sold in California will be zero emissions vehicles. And the California Air Resources Board is also putting out regulations that have a similar effect. For light duty vehicles, it's the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation. And for heavy duty vehicles, which make up a lot of the fleets and really make up a lot of the air pollution in the state, there's the Advanced Clean Fleets rule. So taken together, all of these policy drivers are pushing for greater decarbonization in all sectors. I skipped over the building electrification side, but the air quality management districts are proposing similar rules for zero emission appliances for buildings. But it's not just regulation, we're seeing it in the market side as well. Electric vehicle sales in California are about 25% of all new cars being sold this year, which is pretty incredible. Even back in 2019, which really wasn't that long ago, zero emission vehicles were about 6% of new vehicles sold. So from 6% to 25% in a few years, and it's only going up. So we're seeing the marketplace really respond. Consumers are interested, manufacturers are creating more compelling options, costs are coming down. We're really on track for electric vehicles to become the norm in California. But there's other technology that's getting momentum as well. Emerging technologies, including wind, energy storage. The price is coming down significantly on energy storage, more sophisticated behind the meter resources. This is all helping to drive from a market side. And finally, the government funding, especially the federal funding from the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act, are all helping to catalyze this transition. So taken in its totality, that's really the foundation for why we went back and redid the analysis. And these are the things that are driving the new numbers and sort of the new outcomes. This slide's pretty technical, but I think this is an audience that may appreciate understanding the methodology and where all the results that I'm about to share really come from. What steps go into understanding what it's going to take to achieve decarbonization. And what we do is we start looking across all of California, the entire economy, every single sector, and we say, what will it take from each sector to decarbonize so that collectively we've reduced emissions by at least 85%. From that, we can extract what the transportation sector, what the building sector, what the power sector are all doing, and put that together to get a more detailed view on the electric system, where all of those interact. We build an electric system load for the year 2045. So we take every single hour of that year, 8,760 from the first hour of January 1st all the way through the end of the year, and we model what that load shape will look like. That load shape allows us to then go out and do what's called a capacity expansion. This is determining how much more clean energy generation will be needed in the state to make sure there's always enough generation to supply that load at every single hour throughout the year. That's where we get the big numbers on how much more solar, how much more wind, how much more batteries, et cetera. Something new for us this year is doing a reliability assessment. So the normal IRP planning process that we do for real infrastructure build out and real planning does something called a loss of load expectation study. And the threshold that's been established is called 1 in 10. So for every 10 simulated years, there should only be a loss of load or not enough generation to serve the load in no more than 1 out of 10 scenarios. So we took the year 2045, we applied the same analysis. We created 500 different possible versions of 2045, different climate variables, different weather variables, different random generator outages, and that helped us to create a more robust view of the year 2045. And then we made sure we had enough solar and batteries and clean firm resources to reliably provide electricity in 450 out of those 500. That's that 1 in 10 threshold being applied. Finally, with all the resources identified, with all the load curves mapped out, we can determine how much grid infrastructure will be needed to connect them all. And that helps us get the stats on transmission and distribution infrastructure investments. When you look at the dollars that need to be invested for all the clean energy resources and all the grid, and you divide it by all the load, all that new electricity that's being sold, you can come up with an electric price. And that's how we do the affordability analysis, and where I was able to get the stat that I shared at the top that customers will actually save. So this is the process. This is the methodology. It's very systematic. It takes us several months to go through all these steps of the analysis, but this is what's underneath all the results that we have in this paper. And if anybody's particularly interested, you can read all about each of these steps in a detailed appendix that we published with our paper. So here's the fun part. This is where we get to start talking about what is the future going to look like and how do we get ready for it. So the big story is with all that electrification adoption, the load, the electricity being delivered in California almost doubles. We're seeing that it's going to likely go up by at least 80% by the year 2045 relative to today. That's a huge increase, and that's going to drive pretty much everything else we are going to talk about together. But specifically, the biggest components of that increase are electric vehicles and building electrification. So today, our baseline for light duty vehicles is about 3% of cars on the road. Heavy duty and medium duty vehicles even less. By 2045, with our new analysis, we think that in order to achieve the decarbonization goals, the light and medium duty vehicle sectors need to be about 90% electric, and the heavy duty vehicle sector needs to be over 50% electric. The bars in the middle are what we had in our previous analysis, Pathway 2045, and you can see how some of those drivers that we talked about earlier are pushing these numbers even higher. It's a similar story for building electrification. This is heat pumps for space heating, heat pumps for water heating. It could also be induction cooking, although by energy, that's not as significant as the first two. And our view is that when you look across both residential and commercial buildings, about 95% about 19 out of 20 buildings will need to have adopted heat pumps by the year 2045 to meet the decarbonization goals. So this is a huge driver for new load on the electric grid. So when you add all that up, every single vehicle, every single heat pump, the vehicle's charging when they need to charge, the heat pump's heating when it's cold, you end up with the load shapes that I was talking about. This is a pretty interesting chart on the screen now. This is the peak load day in both the summer and the winter. So the winter loads are in blue, the summer loads are in gold, and the dotted lines are what we had projected back in 2019. And you can see that the solid lines, they're higher across the board, but they're specifically a lot higher in the morning in the winters. And that's all that additional building electrification contributing to a lot of heating demand as businesses are getting going, as people are warming up their homes in the mornings on the coldest day in the winter. And we're anticipating peak electricity demand in the winter across the system will be similar to peak electricity demand in the summer. And this is a big change from how it looks today, where the system load is absolutely driven by peak summer demand. But the adoption of building electrification, we expect, will really change this profile throughout the state. Providing enough clean generation to power all of that electrification load, as well as all of the existing load that will continue to grow as the economy grows, will require a big build out in clean energy generation resources. So the number one resource in the state in 2045 is going to be solar electricity. It's extremely cost competitive. And if you look at the bar on the right, we're estimating, I think, over 60 gigawatts of solar PV capacity at the utility scale in California. That's almost the entire generating capacity of all types in California today. So solar is anticipated to play an absolutely massive role, but it's a pretty diverse stack there on the right. It's not the only resource that we're going to need. Some of the other big ones are storage, both 4 and 8 hour energy storage, which is a great partner to both solar and wind. And then wind. And wind has got a much bigger role to play. One of the more unique additions to our analysis this year is offshore wind, with the state leasing out offshore wind development areas and setting its own goal to have 25 gigawatts of offshore wind generation by 2045. We chose to incorporate it. And that's a little bit in response to the state having a goal, but a lot in response to this being a very cost-effective future resource in our modeling. One of the things about offshore wind is it tends to have a great production profile when electricity is needed most during evening hours as the sun is going down, but electricity, especially in the summer, is peaking. So the offshore wind, we see it as a really valuable and complementary resource in the mix. But, and I'll get to this a little later, there is a lot of work to get from where we are today to having a big, robust offshore wind industry. One of our other big findings, and this comes out of the reliability analysis that I discussed, and is really driven a lot by that winter issue that I showed earlier, is a need for clean, firm generating resources. This could be geothermal, could be a future for nuclear, newer, cleaner, smaller, safer nuclear reactors, but something that's doing zero carbon electricity almost all the time and can provide the energy that can recharge the batteries when renewables might have a down week, maybe a particularly cloudy week across the state. This clean firm is something that can really help to maintain overall system reliability with just a relatively little slice of it in the mix. So this is the big picture. There is an anticipation, as we had last time, that there will be a need to keep some of the state's gas generating fleet online even through 2045. The utilization of this fleet is expected to go down and down and down, but for reliability purposes, having a little bit of dispatchable power is really valuable. And the goal there will be to decarbonize that gas fleet through renewable natural gas or source fuels, including hydrogen, or to push for decarbonization with carbon capture. So while we don't see this as the main strategy, we do see it as a small part of the overall portfolio still, even out to 2045. folks might be interested in this, and I think we have a little bit of time, so I'll try to go into it. This is a little bit more detail on the reliability analysis I've been talking about. So what you see on the screen is 7 days of load in what we simulated as the worst winter week in 2045. And what's happening in this week is it's extremely cold, but it's also extremely cloudy. And so you have a lot of heating demand from the heat pumps, but you don't have a lot of PV production because of the clouds. And that puts you the closest you get into having a possibility that you don't have enough generation to meet the load. And that's the number one reliability concern that we solve for. So what we found were a couple things that were interesting. First of all, the introduction of a long duration energy storage technology, a fairly small amount, about 1.2 gigawatts, would be enough to provide the reliability benefit that the system would need. And if you operate a long duration energy storage by looking a week ahead and anticipating the weather and the PV production, rather than just looking a day ahead and trying to choose when to charge and discharge your batteries on a daily basis, saving a little bit for the cloudy days that you know are coming is what we anticipate is the best strategy for California to be able to most cost effectively maintain reliability. But a little bit of the justification for needing those clean, firm resources that I was talking about is to make sure that if the solar doesn't have enough production on a particularly bad day, I mean, most of the time it's going to do the whole job, but on a particularly bad day or stretch of days, that there is another source that can be there to recharge the significant fleet of batteries that are part of the grid as well. So this is very much a portfolio solution for clean energy. Let's talk a little bit about the grid. This is transmission, as many, if not all of you are familiar, is the biggest and highest voltage part of the electric grid. And this is used to carry energy, increasingly renewable energy, across longer distances. We believe that with all that solar build out, all that new wind, putting those new grid scale batteries in place, and moving all that electricity to load centers for all this electrification demand, there's going to be up to 4 times as much transmission build out that needs to take place going forward as has happened historically. And this isn't just our view, this is aligned with the CAISO transmission planning process. And so it really raises the questions about how best to do it. It's a similar story, but potentially even more acute on the distribution side. Right now, Southern California Edison operates over 4,000 distribution circuits. These are the lower voltage power lines that you would see typically on a wooden pole going through a community, if not underground. And those circuits are all utilized to some extent today. And as load continues to grow, each one of them will reach a limit of the maximum amount of power that they can safely provide, at which point another circuit will need to be built and the load will need to be split between the existing circuit and the new circuit to create additional capacity to continue growing the load. And we see a ramp up over the next 10 years, but especially in the years 2033 going all the way out to 2045, we really start to see a lot of those circuits filling up and the need for a tremendous amount of new circuits. So I'll get into this in a little bit, but we're thinking about how best to be prepared for that so that it's least disruptive, most reliable, most cost effective. And the simple answer of just build more might not be the best answer. So that's part of our going forward work after we did this analysis. So the last big piece of the analysis before I talk about some takeaways is our affordability analysis. I showed the methodology and I said, we first have to figure out what are all the pieces of the puzzle. And the last thing we do is we say, well, what does this cost? And the good news is the finding that we put out in 2019, which was that customers would save money in the long run through this clean power and electrification pathway, that finding holds. And the biggest reason for it is because people spend so much money on gasoline for their vehicles in California that there's a tremendous amount of room in their budget to be able to save by reducing that gasoline expense and still make the investments necessary to build out all this clean energy infrastructure. If you want to look at the numbers specifically, these apply to the average household in the Southern California Edison service area. And today, the average household spends about $1,700 a year on electricity, but they spend over $4,000 a year on gasoline for their vehicles. By 2045, with that electric vehicle adoption and with that heat pump and building electrification adoption, we anticipate that customer electricity expenses will go up from where they are today at about $1,700 to almost $3,000. However, the expense for gasoline for the average household will go way, way down, because on average, most people won't even have a gasoline car. So the savings from avoided fossil fuel purchases should more than make up for the additional expense for clean energy through electricity. So this is a big finding. This is something that we think is really important to the advocacy part of the clean energy transition, because this isn't a sacrifice that people have to make in order to achieve our climate goals. It's an opportunity to be more efficient and capture those efficiencies as savings, while also benefiting from achieving our climate goals and also our clean air goals. One thing that's important, and we emphasize this in our paper, is we need to make sure we're addressing barriers to adopting electrification, making sure every household has the opportunity to get electric vehicles and to get heat pumps so that they have the opportunity to access these savings. Right now, there can be challenges in making sure that those electrification technologies are accessible to sort of all communities. And so there's various programs that we're doing in the state that are offering, for example, incentives in disadvantaged communities to help with the vehicles and the appliances and the infrastructure to make sure that those are accessible to everyone. So that's our affordability analysis. My last slide, and then I'm looking forward to hearing the responses from the other panelists and getting into Q&A. Maybe we'll talk a lot about these topics here, is what do we need to do? So we've got a view on 2045, what's it gonna take to get there? And we focused in our analysis and the paper writing phase on 4 big areas. And since we published in September, we've really been working with stakeholders across the state to try to advance these. But I'll walk through each of them and explain our thinking. The first is on system planning. There's a lot more coordination that we think needs to take place, both at the transmission and the distribution level, to both forecast the need ahead of time and start to build ahead of time, but also to speed up the process and to streamline, especially interconnections. We're a really big fan of zonal planning approaches and looking for regions that have the renewable generating capacity, that have the land use available, that have the buy-in from the community, and starting to proactively accelerate the infrastructure build out in those areas. And we actually think similar ideas could apply equally well on the distribution side. When it comes to generation, I talked a lot today about some of the big new pieces of the puzzle. Offshore wind, 19 gigawatts, that's a huge new addition for the state, but there's an entire industry that needs to be built up to support it. Everything from the supply chain to the workforce to the coastal infrastructure, to having the boats and the vessels that it's going to take to install. And there's 20 years on the clock, but that's not really that much time when you're talking about major infrastructure projects. So we're really out there advocating to make sure we take this seriously and we get started quickly so that we have enough offshore wind generation in operation by the time we really need it. And with clean firm generation, we think there's a lot that needs to be done that's on the investment support side, first of a kind projects, and making sure that these types of technologies that we believe will be really valuable to the state in the future are getting the support from the innovation community that they need today to kind of cross from projects and research into actual products that can do well in the market. When it comes to the transmission grid, man, we have a lot to say about this, and I think others do too. There's a 10 to 12 year average project lifetime for transmission in the state, with 20 years, 21 years left on the clock. We can't get enough transmission built if every project takes over a decade. So there's, we feel like we've been looking under every stone for opportunities to speed up that process. I think there's a lot to be done in permitting. We've actually made some progress recently with the commission just yesterday, announcing some changes in the GO 131. But there's also some redundancies in the process. There's multiple agencies that are involved and some handoffs that don't always need to take place. And at the local level, there's a lot that can be done to standardize the approach, both better engage with the communities, but also be more transparent and hopefully more efficient through the process. And on the distribution side, there's a huge role for customers to play. Rooftop solar, we have an expectation that it will need to double from where it is today. And behind the meter energy storage, we have an expectation that it will need to go up by 10x from where it needs today. So the behind the meter adoption is still a huge part of the equation. And then distributed energy resources, being able to better leverage those through advanced programs like demand response. And finally, the grid itself. I hinted at this earlier, but we're looking at new ideas, new grid architectures, new voltages, new types of grid assets that'll allow us to meet the growing electrification demand within the constraints that exist today, whether that's land use at the local level, whether that's the supply chain, the workforce availability, to make sure that we can continue to expand on the right pace. So that's kind of our big presentation. I will turn it over to the next panelist, and I look forward to getting to the Q&A.
Thanks, Stephen. This is really interesting, very detailed, very comprehensive. Lots of questions, and of course, devil in the details. So dive down. How does the wind portfolio get grown quickly enough? Transmission, how does the permitting speed up? All of that stuff. I think that hopefully the panelists can help weigh in on some of these issues around transmission. The first panelist that we have is V. John White. John is the co-founder of the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies, that's CERT, and he's the legislative director of the Clean Power Campaign. Over his lengthy career, he has been involved in developing legislation and innovative regulatory programs focused on air quality, renewable energy resources, and the mitigation of global warming. Lately, CERT has been focused on transmission and interconnection access and planning of the electric grid. John, happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Fred. And thanks to Stephen for a really extraordinary presentation and reflecting a lot of work and analysis and important data. I think a couple of things stand out to me. One is the scale of the load growth that we're facing is unlike anything we've ever seen. For the last 30 years, our load has been basically flat. And now it's starting to really pick up. And it isn't just electrification of vehicles and buildings. It's also data centers, Bitcoin, and artificial intelligence. I'm told that a data center for artificial intelligence uses 3 times the energy as a regular data center. So this load growth is a very significant factor in our plan. Secondly, we are behind in both interconnections and transmission. And the delays are not necessarily the result of land use conflicts or NIMBYism or things like that, but of the time that it takes to get projects approved by the regulatory agencies. In particular, there's been independent analysis of the process of the Public Utilities Commission, and it's staggering how long it takes from the time a project has been identified and approved by CAISO as being needed to when it actually gets approved by the PUC. And part of the problem for that is duplicative environmental reviews. I'm sorry, I'm in a public place. I apologize for the noise. In any event, we think there's going to be an opportunity and a need to build the transmission a lot faster than what we're doing now. The GD 131 proposal that was mentioned is not satisfactory at the moment, but it's a start. And the good news is that the utilities and labor and NGOs and developers have all reached agreement on a settlement for how to proceed on transmission planning at the PUC. And one of the suggestions is to eliminate duplicative environmental reviews. Right now, the applicant for a transmission project submits a detailed environmental assessment that is the basis of a secret document. But the PUC turns around and uses an independent consultant to do a second environmental assessment that is simply adds to the delay. And so one of the challenges we face, and I don't want to be critical of any particular agency, but I will say that the PUC is very jealous about its authority and protecting its discretion. It doesn't like to hear that it has a role to play other than its role of protecting ratepayers and guarding against excess costs. But in the process, it's sort of like they're missing the big picture, and we're really going to have to find a way to scale our transmission approval process to the challenge of the moment. And we are hopeful, but it may take legislative action of some kind. The other issue is the cost of the transmission is a significant concern. If we use traditional FERC authorized rate of return for the projects, it's a very significant increase in costs compared to if we built it with public money or with DWP's municipal financing. So thinking of creative financing ways of building projects, maybe using state general obligation bonds for loan guarantees. Anyway, we've got to get quicker in our reviews, and we've got to get cheaper in the build out, and we've got to take time to get this right, recognizing that there's a sense of urgency that we just don't have time to waste.
Okay, should we just move along then, John, to our next reviewer?
I want to be sure there's time for questions. So I didn't want to, I'm happy to talk further or respond to questions, but I wanted to not dominate the ride.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very much appreciated. So excellent considerations. Let's move along then. We have next up, we have Marisa Mitchell from Intersect Power. Marisa leads land use planning, community engagement, and environmental policy for Intersect. She's worked on renewables since 2006 with a focus on minimizing environmental impacts and maximizing environmental enhancements. She has a wealth of experience with development, from site selection through construction. She's also conversant with environmental laws and policies and maintains close relations with key regulators. So please welcome Marisa.
Thanks very much, Fred. Appreciate it. So in reviewing the Countdown to 2045 document, it really does describe the implementation challenges that our state's ambitious decarbonization goals at a level of technical detail that really hasn't been previously illuminated. So for example, getting to net zero will require 85 new and 350 upgraded distribution substations by 2045. It'll require 8 gigawatts of capacity added to the high voltage transmission system per year. And so as a clean power producer, Intersect Power has been calculating what implementation means for solar in the state over the next couple of decades as well. And the challenge will involve converting between 500,000 and 1 million acres of land in solar across the state, and building solar generation capacity 4 times faster than the fastest year the industry has ever done it. So we're doing our part by developing multi-gigawatt scale projects at this point, rather than projects that are just in the hundreds of megawatts only. And some of the policy challenges kind of that are still barriers and changes that are needed for implementation are worth highlighting. We absolutely support, as the document did as well, CAISO interconnection reforms that prioritize commercially ready generators. We live in a time now that can no longer plan for just-in-time procurement of equipment. controlling your supply chain is the new normal and will absolutely differentiate generators that can get online quickly versus those will experience substantial delays. So absolutely support that. It's a needed reform. And while we've seen numerous permit streamlining benefits, especially for solar generators coming out of the last couple of legislative sessions, which are crucial for rapid solar build out, we're also seeing a lot of emphasis by various stakeholders to make solar wear too many hats. And we're a little bit concerned about potentially new policy changes or new policies being adopted that might be less than pragmatic. And I wanted to highlight a couple of these. For example, we're seeing a lot of stakeholders pushing the idea that agrivoltaics, or combining solar photovoltaics with productive commercial agriculture, is a feasible and necessary dual use of the state's agricultural lands. However, we're kind of at a pivotal moment in the state of California as regards agricultural lands, because we're projecting that up to 1 million acres of farmland are losing irrigation water as a result of pumping curtailments required under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in the Central Valley, especially. So repurposing these lands for exclusively solar, rather than attempting to also continue irrigated agriculture, really is the highest and best use of the land. And so that's one of those nuances that is really important to highlight in pragmatic policy solutions. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of emphasis from stakeholders that are looking at each and every solar facility to provide habitat for pollinators, which can be fairly straightforward in certain contexts. It also can be very difficult, very costly when solar facilities are, for example, surrounded by a matrix of agricultural lands or lands encumbered by noxious weeds, or where legal barriers exist. For example, if protected pollinators could be attracted by a solar facility. It has a whole new set of regulatory requirements when you get into that situation. So it's important that ensuring flexibility and dual uses where feasible, that this will ensure a new fleet of generators can come online quickly without undue barriers to implementation. So pragmatic dual use policies, they're really important to make the highest and best use of these lands to ensure and make sure we don't adopt new policy barriers that would interfere with rapid decarbonization. So just a couple of land use considerations for the group, and I'll stop there, and Fred, we can move on to the next speaker.
Fred, you're on mute.
Thank you, Ed. All right, next up we have Ed Smeloff. Ed is an independent consultant currently working with CERT and Grid Lab. He worked for a long time with Vote Solar. That's when I first came to know Ed back in the early 2000s. He's focused on transmission planning and policy and on issues related to resource adequacy, integrated resource planning and transmission planning at proceedings before the California Public Utilities Commission, the California Independent System Operator, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So please welcome Ed.
Thanks, Fred. And Stephen, I really appreciate the presentation, the work that Southern California Edison has done. I think this is a really landmark study that should be used to inform policy across the board among policymakers at the CEC, CAISO, and Public Utilities Commission. I'm really intrigued by the finding. I think is very compelling, the affordability finding, because I think that is going to be a major issue facing all of us as we try to move forward to decarbonize the economy, is can we do so in a manner that's affordable? And the analysis that you've done that has looked across sectors, that looks at electricity, gasoline, and natural gas is really important. It's not, I mean, it's for us who are steeped in this, it may be common sense, but I think for the average person out there who is kind of, consuming energy in the three sectors, it may not be apparent at first. And we need to do a really good job of explaining that while the cost and the amount of electricity you're going to need will go up, there's the compensating offsets from the other sectors. Obviously, there will be pushback from the interests that are part of that sector, particularly natural gas, as we begin to reduce the amount of gas, there's going to be less throughput through the gas pipeline system. And while some of that is, the pipelines are still going to be necessary for a period of time, that's going to have financial impacts on the gas utilities and customers. So we really need to focus on how do we explain this affordability benefit that comes through electrification. Second point I wanted to make was one about optionality on transmission. We have no time to lose on building transmission. We need to build transmission, put it into the rate base. In large part, I know there's a lot of excitement about the subscriber model that the CAISO is now implementing, and the fact that a couple of transmission projects from Wyoming and New Mexico will be built without necessarily going through the planning process and being studied, but there's certain risks that are being taken, but there's some real benefits of doing it that way. But we can't let that become the exclusive model for developing and financing transmission, because we have multiple benefits from transmission. And so we need to think about the multiple benefits and the optionality. When I was doing solar development back in the 2005-2006 period, the Tehachapi Regional Transmission Project was being built on the assumption that there was a lot of wind in the Tehachapi, and some of us on the solar side said, well, there's a lot of good land out there in Antelope Valley as well. And so, make a long story short, that project, even though it wasn't built for solar, ended up being a very useful project for expanding solar. I think the same is true with offshore wind and advanced geothermal and long duration energy storage. We don't completely know. We don't have a crystal ball on the cost trajectory of those technologies. They're all promising, but there can be hiccups and surprises. We're seeing a little bit of that now with offshore wind. So we need to build transmission that can be used for consumer benefits, regardless if there are sort of changes in the economics of any single technology. And then sort of lastly, I wanted to go to the issue of reliability. I was really intrigued by that winter scenario that you put up there, and the need that we need to think about reliability beyond sort of scheduling a day ahead. We need to, at least in the wintertime, think a week ahead or several days ahead, so that we're dispatching the resources, long duration energy storage and these firm resources, sort of based on the best weather data that we're projecting out a week ahead. And I think that's really sort of a key insight that your report has produced, is the need for us to think about operational issues and resource adequacy in a different way. We have a little bit of time to do that, because I don't think we're going to get that winter peak right away, but it's coming. So I know Edison's led the way a lot around the slice of day, and I think your study did kind of use that paradigm as you looked about reliability values of the resources. So I will leave my comments there, and let's leave, I guess, 10 minutes or so for Q&A. Or maybe you want to respond to what John and Melissa and I said first, and then do some Q&A.
Well, I'll respond briefly, because I think the Q&A is going to be really valuable for folks. Thank you all for your comments and for reinforcing a lot of what we're out trying to message, and for the work you're doing. I don't have a lot to go into detail other than to say very good points, and we absolutely agree. And especially John, you went into like specific details of duplicate processes and all sorts of stuff, and we went down that rabbit hole too. And I think what we've got to do is take this stuff and make it a lot more apparent to folks, because once we can name it as a challenge, we can start to really work through better solutions.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is, how can we build a coalition of stakeholders, everybody pulling in the same direction and working together in a collaborative sense to get to the 4 times what we're doing now, the 8 or 10 times what we're doing now. That's all really sort of, I think, key. I was wondering if people in the audience would like to ask questions. Please put your questions either in chat or in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them. In the meantime, there is a question: is Southern Cal Edison purchasing energy from smaller providers or building all directly?
Yeah, we're purchasing energy from the market. So we're doing some building, but by and large, most of the energy that we serve to our customers is procured through the wholesale market, and there's a variety of producers of all sizes who are contributing into that. And as it grows, that'll continue to be the story.
Right. Another question that I have is so the reliance on weather data. One of the things that we've noticed lately is that that the climate is heating more quickly than we have thought in the past. And so I'm wondering what you were able to access in terms of projections for climate data for this region.
Oh, this is a good question. So this is another benefit that we had from doing the analysis again. 2019, we did not have climate-informed analysis. Between 2019 and today, we actually spent a couple years doing the state's first utility climate vulnerability assessment. And that helped us to understand the likelihood that climate change and its various impacts, whether that's extreme heat, longer heat waves, flooding, sea level rise, drought, all of it. We said, how are our assets, how are our operations, and how are the services we provide, even our community, is going to be affected by this in the year 2030, the year 2050, and the year 2070. And in order to do that, we had to develop a lot more skill and a lot more competency in terms of climate science and climate modeling than we've ever had in the history of our company. And the good news is those people still work with us. And so when the next challenge comes around and we say, how are we going to reach our clean energy goals for 2045? We did it in a climate informed way. So the loading, the air conditioning demand, the heating demand, that all takes into account the climate change scenarios for 2050 that we use for our climate analysis. And so even the derating of the production, the derating of the limits of what the distribution and the transmission systems can carry on the hottest days. A lot of those are thermally limited systems. This time around, we were actually able to incorporate it's the IPCC, the big UN body that does climate science. They create the global climate models. And then we're all very fortunate to be in California, a state that takes this seriously, because California has created what's called a downscaled version. They've taken sort of a big picture view on climate change and got a higher resolution estimate for what that means locally in each, I think it's 6 kilometer by 6 kilometer square throughout California. So we're able to apply the data at that level, thanks to a lot of work being done by scientists throughout the state.
Thank you for that.
Stephen, I work with Grid Lab, which is a nonprofit organization, and just published a paper looking at advanced conductors, some of the newer conductors that are available in the market. And one of the issues that Grid Lab is looking at is how can we make better use of existing rights of way and existing infrastructure to get more throughput, higher energy densities on the corridors. And sort of two big ideas are, one is to use advanced conductors that not the ACSR, but ones that have composite cores or different ways of being designed. And then the other is conversion to HVDC on those corridors. How much is Edison looking at that, or how did that factor in at all, or is that something that's kind of in another part of the organization to think about?
Both. We have several parts of the organization that are looking at HTLS, high temperature, low sag, not just the superconducting, but the advanced conductor materials, the dynamic line ratings, the ambient adjusted ratings, the DC for high voltage, even DC at the distribution level. We have a grid tech innovation shop that's very serious about upskilling our understanding and even catalyzing the market. We need suppliers that are able to provide the assets, and we have a growth and innovation team that does venture investment and tries to actually support some of these companies. We made an investment this year in a company that does automated line stringing that will help with using drones to get transmission built faster and safer. So I think I don't remember where it is, but somewhere in the paper we talk about the role that grid enhancing technologies, which is a nice umbrella term for a lot of this, can play in getting more utilization out of existing rights of way and existing infrastructure. We don't think there's one, silver bullet. Hey, we're just going to pick our favorite thing and run with it, and we'll be able to do 4x or 10x more of it. We see it more like a little bit from here, a little bit from there, a little bit from this other place, a little bit and this other way. And together we reach the overall goal of a combined, 4+ times pace. But it's going to be more capacity out of existing lines, more lines in existing rights of way, new lines in new rights of way. And when it all comes together, we're, providing transmission for the 4x solar that Marisa is talking about. So that's kind of how we see it.
Stephen, early on in the presentation, you talked about a transition to heat pumps, both from the residential point of view and in buildings. And this is a question for anybody. How are we going to get 80 or 90% of the buildings that are out there right now retrofitted with heat pumps? Can anybody help me answer that?
I don't know if anybody would like to.
Yeah,
I can start.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, and then Ed, you can take it away. It's a fair question, Fred, and it's a huge challenge. I'll be really transparent about what we modeled. And this is all detailed in the appendix to our study. The transparency in our approach is really important to the credibility we want to have. But we assumed that different air quality management districts would pass zero emission appliance regulations in the late 2020s and the early 2030s. And then we assumed a stock turnover equation, basically an end of life replacement cycle for fossil powered appliances. And when they need to be replaced after the zero emission appliance regulations go in order, a little bit earlier in the Bay Area, we assumed, than the rest of the state, then we sort of baked in, and it's a little bit of an unanswered set of assumptions. We baked in that the retrofitting would have to take place in order to install the new zero emission appliance at end of life of the existing appliance. But the reality is obviously a lot more complicated than that. And with the building stock being as old as it is, and every building being unique in some ways, and the expenses that are associated with doing those retrofits, there is a lot more to still figure out. We have an application pending with the commission, maybe everybody knows about it, for a building electrification program. But even in that application, we acknowledge there's going to be panel upgrades and customer-sided electrical infrastructure that needs to be upgraded in order for this transition to be entirely feasible. And when I talked about equity in the affordability slide, we need to make sure all those costs are taken into account as well.
So
I would just amplify that on the equity side. I think it's really critically important to think about those customers who live in older homes that need to have panel upgrades, that can't maybe afford the first cost of a heat pump. So the legislature and public policymakers need to think about how do we provide the resources so there aren't groups that are left behind in the transition.
Are we thinking about subsidy programs or that sort of thing?
Well, I think there's part of that in the SGIP program that the PUC administers for heat pumps. I'm not in the weeds on that, but I think people are beginning to think about how do you manage this in a way that's equitable.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a pretty complex landscape right now. There's at least a half a dozen different kind of building decarbonization programs that are funded in the state, and a lot of really thoughtful players. But I think what they're all asking for is more support, more financing, because the scale of what we're talking about is massive, and the trajectory we're going to have to get onto to achieve it by 2045 is a lot steeper than the one we're on right now.
Right. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of the hour. I would like to really thank Stephen and everybody, John, Marisa, Ed. Ron for opening the session. Ron, do you have some closing statement?
Oh, Fred, again, just thanks for the participants, and we hope this is not just simply an afternoon of an hour, but will be watched by many people.
Indeed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to everybody.